Hey everybody, my name is Ian. Today we're talking about Tasting the Past, which is chapter 5 of Diane Ty's Baking as Biography. And rather than picking a recipe from chapter 5, I'm going to be picking a recipe from chapter 2. It's the chocolate chip cookie recipe. It's the recipe that became Mark's go-to. Mark being Diane's younger brother, the youngest child. He is the one who was perhaps the pickiest of the eaters, at least expressed pickiness, and therefore someone whose taste was catered to the most. He's also the one who, benefits from being the youngest. With all the sort of the doting that happens upon that privileged position. And he's also the one who is such a great informant, a term that we still questionably use in folklore, for Diane when she talks about this last chapter. And the chocolate chip cookie recipe became something that was Laureen's reputation, at least among neighborhood kids, and therefore among neighborhood adults and envious parents. And she would share her recipe gladly, and yet she would not necessarily get a huge amount of, like I said, no one was able to sort of imitate what she did. And so she remained that status. But again, her baking wasn't something that she liked. This is 3/4 of a cup of brown sugar and a 1/4 cup of shortening. And I begin, as ever, by creaming it. If I had known how much creaming was involved in baking, I would have looked up creaming when I started videoing number 1. So chapter 5, Tasting the Past, is very much about the idea of baking as not baking as a legacy, but what is the legacy of her baking? I mean, it's more than simply a conclusion. It's a rumination on the nature of what we bring forward from generation to generation. And therefore, you can sort of look at it as a kind of mandala on the nature of folklore itself. And that we have this culture that we live in. The culture is vibrant, and the culture is flexible, and the culture moves, and the culture is comprised, for the large part, of acts that are meaningful to us, but also often not reflected upon. And they are not cast in stone. They are not understood as necessary and inert and enshrined because they are flexible and performative. But then generations move on. And all of a sudden, those things that were part of our life are disappearing because our lives have changed. So looking on this on the macro level, you can think of the very discipline of folklore itself as emerging at a time when a group was seeing that the practices that it remembered from its past, or it understood as somehow important, somehow speaking to who we are, were disappearing, or in threat of disappearing. Certainly among the middle classes, the sort of privileged, thick political center of England, the United States, Canada. These were gone in part because they had been educated out of us. That we were now, our classical educations, our understanding of true culture existed in the lives of the Greeks and the Romans, and subsequently in Italian and French, and the language of scholarship and the language of courtship and so on. And then, well, what is it to be English or German or Scandinavian? This is a conversation that we've had many times over the course of these videos. And so the past is turned back to in an effort of sort of reclaiming, but it's done through with a different lens. It's because now it has this element of it being fragile and limited, we seek out these models that we can carry forward into the next generation, that we can retain, that we can enshrine, that we can, at the very least, record and possibly hold up as new models. But they become, their very fragility, or the sense that they are fragile, makes us treat them as if they were just shy of sacred. And so we treat them in a way that is very different from how they existed in the day-to-day. So this book is one person's reflection on that, thinking about the processes of folklore that she knows because she's a folklorist, but then in her own life, how these things that were at one point dynamic performances that were non-reflective and just what one did, and were immediate and were fluid and were dynamic. How, when the person responsible for that is gone, what happens to this? And do we enshrine these things? And when I say that Loreen was not reflective, that is not to mean that she was not. I mean, I think it's been clear throughout the book. It's not to suggest in any way that she is not an intelligent interpreter of these things, that she is not diligent. Far from it, but not reflective in terms of she isn't holding these things as sacrosanct. She isn't holding these things as some kind of special practice. And that is abundantly clear because she doesn't even like it very much. She doesn't do it for her own benefit. She does it to a certain extent for Henry's benefit, because even though Henry has a professed ambivalence towards food, nevertheless he does have tastes and appetites and expectations, and so she meets those. But it's not something that she's particularly prissy about, as it were. It's just the thing that she has to do. It's the thing that she has to do in all realms of her life. The one thing I forgot to get out was the egg. I try and prepare everything early. And now Loreen is gone. Loreen cannot be an informant for Diane, and she can't be a baker for her family anymore. She can't fulfill this thing that was so non-reflective, to the point where that one moment when Kathy can't even remember her mother baking, as opposed to Diane, whose basic memory of her mother is, or one of the core memories of her mother is in the kitchen baking, and one of the other core memories is coming home and engaging with her mother's baking. Things that at the time she didn't necessarily think about, but are now core legacies. One beaten egg. Cream that. And we add the slug of vanilla now. Why not? Maybe that's too much. But can you really have too much vanilla? Chances are someone is saying, yes, you certainly can. But I can't hear you. If baking did comprise much of what she did, her recipes, irrespective of what her intent was, do comprise something about her legacy, something about what is left over, something about the work of this woman that was so invisible, and nevertheless it was so central to the day-to-day activities, her own personal activities in terms of her friendship groups and the carving time out for herself that we discussed in chapter 4, her occupation as minister's wife that we talked about in chapter 3, and the expectation of sort of having a public persona and the competition, the implicit competition, and the way of doing piety, the way of being not simply a good member of the community, but in a way a good Christian, a good United Church woman, and a good citizen, was in part through the application of her baking skills, and of course as a good matriarch in chapter 2. So much effort, so much time, and now she is gone, and for what? So who carries on that legacy? Diane reflects on her own life, on her own role in this, in part because, she is the elder. sister. She is the eldest child. She is in that sort of assumed. Oh, I was meant to sift this. Oh, well, that was fairly well sifted. That's a cup of flour. That's a half teaspoon of salt. It's a half a teaspoon of soda. Oh, again, I'm not good at this. But we'll stir. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. So, as the elder sister, does she sort of almost by default become the inheritor of these? Certainly, she was the one who laid claim, or whether again through just simply, oh, I'll hold on to these, just sort of on a de facto perfunctory kind of way, or as like an academic exercise because she was a folklorist at the time of her mother's death, and it's just like, well, I will hold on to these, and these constitute, the archival instinct kicking in. It's just like, we'll hold on to them because we hold on to them, before she even had an idea for them as a project, and even before she had an idea for them as assuming them. There's a little sort of biographical gap in how much the baking emerged within or outside of her role of being a mother, because I don't think Callum was born by the time Lorraine passed away. So when Diane's assumed, when Diane's self-definition also incorporated mother, when did baking sort of re-emerge as a value? It seems very dry, but there we go. It's just one egg that seems to be doing an awful lot of the work. So, where was I talking about? What was I talking about? So Diane picks and chooses, like we all do from tradition, but she needs to reflect on this. That it depends on the audience, that she doesn't make these things for her own sort of professional baking expectations, where not in, different from sort of church women's organizations, but as a member of a faculty at a university, and potlucks and things to bring over for students. I mean, that there is this implicit idea where you're kind of, sometimes you are taking care of students by providing good food in plenty. And if there is some kind of social occasion, you do extra in order to compensate for the students who can only contribute modest things. And this might be one of the few opportunities for students to experience those sort of, it's difficult to talk about that when you're talking about adults in their 20s, but that's sort of in loco parentis tastes of home. But the sweetness, the daintiness, the refined sugar-laden treats that remind her of the kind of things that her mother brought to these sorts of occasions don't do, because the tastes have changed. And when she entertains for family, when she entertains for friends, she's much more focused on the main courses. And oddly enough, she's focused on main courses that are, again, not Nova Scotian cuisine, but are either Italian or Far Eastern, or other kinds of ways of doing cosmopolitanism. So it's really only for her family and for herself that she bakes. And she has her prize recipes that she selects from. And so it's a matter of audience, an audience where the baking is explicitly tied in. Well, I guess the two audiences, the audience for Peter and Callum, and particularly for Callum, they are the appropriate way. Her baking becomes part of the appropriate way for her to do the nurturing work. The same kind of thing. So providing the fillers, providing the domestic treats. And she has this in an aside. And I've been reading this book for 10 years, and every now and then there's a sentence that I have overlooked. But the idea that the only sort of real, for her, like the proper treat is still something that is homemade. She is well aware that her entire family and the culture in which she lives is much more predisposed towards buying things. And there's no shame, there's no stigma associated with buying things. And presumably she does buy things as well. But she's sort of, rather than Laureen's strict idea that there's no occasion that's good enough for, fancy enough to have a store-bought, I think it's almost the reverse, in that fancy occasions require homemade. And that is the proper way of showing display and showing nurturing. So these recipes don't conform to contemporary aesthetics for her family. And so, but they do. And when she cooks not only for Callum and Peter, but when she cooks for, bakes for Henry or Mark or Kathy, it is expressly these more marked performances that are directing attention towards the shared experience of growing up. Henry doesn't continue these, in part because he was never a cook, he was never a baker, and his general disinterest in food, and coupled with his general inabilities, not simply the performative inabilities of sort of male incompetence that mark some of the narratives of early life that we read earlier in the chapters, but just why develop a skill when you have someone else who's providing it for you and you don't really see much of the value in the finished product to begin with. His life is fairly simple, his meals are fairly basic, but for him it's the register of time that becomes part of the condition. I'm using my hands, they were clean. So, oh, that's good. Now we're starting to look like it. It's still really dry. So this is half a cup. This is half a cup chocolate chips, which seems an awful lot, and half a cup of walnuts. And the chocolate chips are just, the ingredient is not listed, but it was immediately listed with half a cup of walnuts. So, wow. I had no idea. I've been enjoying this baking because I haven't been. I've been then power eating it and then feeling very sick the past week because I sort of get these massive sugar rushes and so on. It's not actually that great. But I've been enjoying learning the processes, but I still don't have any idea of like what a cup of flour turns into after it's being baked. Like, is it this much or is it this much? And then you throw in soda. And it's like, oh, soda's a big lie. Soda's just a way to confuse a dumb person like myself. So Henry notes how baking for him is about, or cooking, food in general, is about sort of the passing of the seasons. And he only really has two food traditions that he carries on. And one is pumpkin pie, just after Halloween or Thanksgiving, and he follows a recipe. And the other one is strawberry jam. Even if it's not something that he has a huge amount of use for, it is just his way of marking the year. So he'll, and sometimes he will wait until the family is together for them to collectively make it. And that is basically how the limit to which he extends his sort of celebration or his continuation of Laureen's legacy. Mark, he tends to sort of reproduce the tastes because a lot of his memories, in part by being the younger child, and not simply the matter of sort of additional attention, but he was a child. Most of his childhood occurred when she was in her stage of fewest obligations at the home and at the church. So his childhood is much more marked by Amherst and the idea of she had already gone through the process of carving out time for herself. Henry was more itinerant, often away on trips. She loved going to restaurants. So whenever he sees a restaurant, she liked going to restaurants, and she liked, as such, she liked taking him to restaurants as well. So while Diane was off at university and Kathy was, like an older teenager, able to take care of herself more, Mark was the young kid who got to go with mom while mom had hamburgers or snacks from a cafe instead of stuff that she made. So he doesn't really, he nor anyone in his family really repeat those repeat her cooking in his day-to-day life. But still, food is sort of has that sort of elemental aspect to it. So he still has those associations and definitely remembers those tastes, and will sometimes get them prepared for him by Diane, who continues in her matriarchal role as a caregiver. All right, I keep on mixing. You think that's seem to be a whole bunch of loose ones at the bottom. I don't think that's a big problem per se. To me, it feels a little bit wasteful. I'm supposed to, man, it just feels wet, or not wet enough, I should say. But all right, here we go. Let's go. Drop by the spoonful onto a greased sheet. This isn't grease, this is a cooking or baking mat. I do have another tray, which is smaller, which is round, and is greased. But I'll be making 2 batches because I'm doing this in the counter oven, which is not the name of it. What's it called? I'm sure I'm supposed to be pressing these down with a fork afterwards or something clever like that. And then we turn to Kathy. Now Kathy has a different childhood from Diane's and Mark's, in part because she was, by being deaf, she felt not through any express intent by the rest of the family, but she felt like an outsider. This is in part because when she was young, the overarching methodology for teaching the deaf was not to have the family sign, and basically she would need to, at home, the expectation that she would need to adopt almost exclusively to a hearing family, as opposed to the hearing family accommodating them. So as such, she felt literally left out of conversations and the nuances of conversations, and there was a certain growing distance. There was also some backstory, which I think is elided. I'm not going to make too much conjecture, but we can perhaps suggest what was going on in terms of with her first marriage, and the expectation that that he didn't like her cooking, he wanted his mother's cooking. And that never quite. It meant that within a few years, she had more or less fully adopted to her own mother-in-law's cooking. So I'm just going to do, as I said, I'm going to do it in 2 batches. In for 10 minutes. Well, check after 10. So some of the subtext around Diane's sister, around Kathy, has to do with the idea that food choice is actually quite a contributing factor to domestic tensions, and the rejection of a wife's food is often a form of a certain amount of control, in a similar way to the way the rejection to cook is at least an attempt to wrest control. And she speaks a lot in this part, which again I think is that issue of control is kind of key, and that one of the things about women's domestic labor in general is that even though she might be responsible for it, she does not necessarily have control. So it's that both and that ultimately she is the one who has to execute it without necessarily being the one, in all instances, to have much of a say in what gets going. The second batch is going to be super chocolate chippy because I'm sort of scooping them up and not forcing them in, which I think will be kind of awesome. I'm also making them much smaller just because. Who knows? This is probably also going to be the batch that is just pure cookie dough and chocolate chips. That'll be what gets eaten raw once the camera gets turned off. Yeah, I don't think I can do much more of these. This is basically just chips now. This is a weird recipe, but maybe it's because I put in too much chocolate chips. We will see. Yums. Okay. What's also apparent in the in this chapter is that as she looks back, not simply on her mother's recipes, but on her grandmother's recipes, she is reminded about how they are in flux, and that this thing that for her is, for Diane, is so, in many ways, capital T tradition, that this is the taste of the past. This is the taste that could disappear if we do not actively engage in reproducing it. And for her, it is something that needs to be brought forward and needs to be sustained. And when I say for her, I think that is, in a way, the impulse that we have with when we remember and we celebrate the performances of the people that we love, like her mother. And so in order to keep her mother alive, she needs to keep her mother's performances alive. Obviously, ritualistically. But we're doing that. I mean, again, we speak to that basic idea, that Proustian moment, but it is ritual. It is the imagined community, and it is sort of like Turner's idea of ritual, in that by eating her mother's cookie, or by creating something that resembles her mother's cookie, she is, through the sensory experience, taste and smell and texture, and sight, sound, you know what senses are, things that are pure experience and not, they can be intellectualized, but they are not intellectual in and of themselves. They can be reflected upon, but they do not require reflection for them to be experienced. She is transported, sent, as it were, back to her mother's kitchen. And that is something, that is one of the reasons that people re-perform things. It's one of the reasons, the very engines of the idea of tradition itself. Henry Glassey's idea of tradition is the contemporary understanding, or constructing the present out of the past. I think those are the terms. I'll probably put the actual quote down here somewhere. But tradition is about how we reassemble those things of the past in order for us to relive them. They do not exist outside of our performance of them. And so that is what she is doing. Simultaneously, of course, she is a folklorist and recognizes these as impulses, recognizes these as conceits, but she doesn't want to bisect herself in that I know I am a folklorist. I know the understandings. I know the dynamics of tradition. I know that this is a re-performance. And yet, when I eat this, I am transported. And she lays that on the table. And again, it becomes this rationale. Now, she knows that it's only for particular audiences. She knows that it is the food that she makes from Lorraine's cookbook is basically now only for that re-performance of the past. And she thinks about her mother's cookbook, her mother's recipe collection, thinks about her grandmother's recipe collection, and how there is not much continuity there either. That Lorraine did not have many recipes from Belle. In fact, Belle had as many, if not more, recipes from Lorraine. Belle received a copy of sweet-tested recipes. Lorraine sent her a copy with annotations in it, like, this one's good. You should try this one. And Belle took that because the things that were actively being created at the time, the performances that were happening, and I know I'm using the word performance, but get used to it. The performances that Lorene was doing at the time, the performances that Belle was doing at the time, was meeting the immediate needs and immediate expectations. And sometimes those immediate needs and immediate expectations are about recreating an imagined past for their audiences, and sometimes they are not. And they are about meeting those expectations. They are about creating the adopting to or understanding their audience's tastes, understanding their audience's dynamism as much as their conservatism, understanding that the audience likes to be challenged and is coming across new experiences. And then I would like to reproduce these experiences at home. And as being the person who's primarily responsible for creating these experiences at home, from doing these performances in the domestic sphere, they learn and they adapt. I mean, we've encountered how Lorene was constantly on the look for recipes that her children would like. And these chocolate chip cookies are a particular example. They became Mark's thing. Mark was exposed to chocolate chip cookies, presumably at one point. They became his thing. And then this entered into her repertoire. So, but there is these eruptions from generation to generation. So this thing that is marked as traditional, and again, moving simply away from Diane to Atlantic Canada in general, these tastes of home, these traditional baking things that are present in the early 21st century as being indicative of a kind of pre-modern now, that they are almost framed in this sort of anti-modernism context. They're inventions of the 1950s and 1960s. They do not extend much beyond the present day's grandparents. So if we are speaking to people who are in their 70s and 80s, so just Diane's parent, like Henry's age, Henry's age, maybe even a little bit younger. These are the tastes that they were just encountering in these post-war years, in this critical decade of the 50s and 60s, where all of a sudden these new tastes were being introduced, and they were being introduced as a means of being good housewives, good contributors to the Canadian economy, and elegant cosmopolitan people. And that's the tastes. Those are the foods that were sort of being snuck in, both as the home food was with molasses and oatmeal and all those things, but also what was being performed. And then at home, they're always being performed outside the house, like the church ladies. And then what happens at home is this fluid idea of the nurturing work. And then this nurturing work, the taste of the nurturing work, is what is now being looked back upon in that level of reflection. The Proustian moment in À la recherche du temps perdu, when it's the mix of the macaroon and the particular herbal tea, when he is eating that, he's already stating that these were combinations that he didn't typically have, and it was only coming back to this place where this food was available that then he had the sensory experience and moved beyond and moved back, and then the entire novel opens up from that one moment. But the food was already of this different era. It wasn't sort of like, I had a cookie and I'll boo. It's like, no, I had a cookie that reminded me of this particular moment of in my aunt's parlor. I've had the timer, so I'm going to check. Oh my goodness. I think those might be just about perfect. So I'm going to put these in. Oh, very nice. So this very idea of what we bring forward from the previous generation as somehow static, we need to remember that it was never static, that these things that we now frame as traditional or tastes of the past or whatever are just these singular moments. Now, they have certain consistency over time, just like this batch of cookies. It was done the same way over a long period of time. Each batch was a unique performance, but there was an effort at consistency from time to time. And so there were these pauses, these moments of stasis, these eras of stasis. But for the makers themselves, once this ceased to be something that was needed to be perpetuated or needed to be done to meet the expectations of consistency from the audience, it faded. And I think that's a good way of ending the book, remembering that these things that we talk about are always dynamic, intelligent, and creative processes, and it's only in this weird retrospect that we where we start to enshrine them, where we start to keep them whole. Because the last thing is one of Diane's dilemmas, and it's the dilemma of this veneration of the past and the people who were there. Because it's not, I mean, Lorraine's life is definitely missed, but Lorraine's contexts are not. And Diane does not want to reproduce the context in which this creativity emerged. She does not want to be a 1950s and 60s and 70s Atlantic Canadian housewife with all the connotations. No matter how much she recognizes the creativity and the intelligence and the acuity and all those values, and however much she recognizes that it is a form of labor and a form of identity work, and that the things that Lorraine did should be valued appropriately. It was also a context of limited choice. It was a context of that inevitably asks the counter history, what would Lorraine have done were these things not incumbent upon her? And I think wouldn't have baked as much is probably the least of the things that Lorraine could have done. So memory work is a form of play, and it's a form of theater, but it shouldn't necessarily let us lead us too firmly down the path of venerating the past that allowed for these conditions, of venerating the this moment as if it were an idyllic time. It's one thing to celebrate the creativity of the people who are trapped within it, while and it doesn't mean that you can't say, but they shouldn't have been trapped within it. And there's this one thing, I'm going to end more or less on this, and it's one of her last comments. My mother's cookies and cakes now provide me with the pleasure of a little voyeurism or culinary tourism into the past. They allow me to flirt with the idea of being the perfect 1950s mother, however unlikely the reality of that is, or how little I really aspire to this unrealistic model of mothering and domesticity. These recipes, thankfully, do not reflect my life. The story they tell is only partly mine, as it is only partly shared by my father, my brother, and my sister. Mostly, the recipes tell my mother's story in ways that reveal many of the cultural conventions and social restrictions placed on women of her generation. They speak of the exacting expectations and heavy social obligations connected with being a church lady, the importance placed on being the right kind of mother as indicated by a full cookie jar, and the too few opportunities for women to come together purely for enjoyment, away from the demands of their social roles and family and community responsibilities. Importantly, they also point to ways in which women resisted these demands. For all these reasons, I do not mourn their passing and the type of woman's life they were part of. I've noticed myself in this doing that thing where I am talking about how her argument is good, but it can apply to different contexts as well. And I hope that doesn't necessarily in any way indicate that it's like, yeah, women, but you can apply this into a larger thing. That isn't the case that I'm trying to say. As if it's only worth reading because it illustrates things that are different, but with the implication that different is somehow more important. This is a wonderful piece of It is a wonderful piece of folklore. It is a wonderful piece of women's folklore. It's a wonderful piece of Atlantic Canadian history. And it deserves all the accolades. I cannot stress how much I love Diane Ty's work, and I love Diane Ty in general. And now I'm going to taste her cookies. This is clearly not the... I actually think these look pretty good. I think they're probably cooled off enough. It's been about 10 minutes. They might be a little bit warm. I don't know if they have the satisfying snap because they seem a little bit good, but ooh, I should do this here. Ooh, yeah, look at that. Huh? That's a cookie. I'm going to take a taste. Yep. That works. Got a little someone in the next room who's going to enjoy this. Finally, this being a folklorist thing is paying off for him. So anyway, that was chapter 5 and the last chapter of Diane Ty's Baking His Biography, with the chapter titled Tasting the Past. As ever, my friends, I wish you nothing but the best. Eat well, be well, and I will see you soon. Bye-bye.